Greetings. Welcome to Week 3, Justice 212, Criminal Procedures, or in the real world, Constitutional Law. That's what we normally call this class. First week of the semester, first lecture of the semester. Some of you have noticed, you've kind of sent me emails saying, where's the lectures? Hopefully I'd mentioned I kind of took the first couple of weeks off. I was on the road, and it's hard enough to do these from home, let alone motel room. I think this lecture sounds pretty good. I'm looking at my window over the top of my monitor here. It's a beautiful sunny day here today. The neighbor is chopping wood with his chainsaw, and the last lecture, I think you could hear it a lot in the background, but he appears to be loading wood now, and maybe he's not sawing anymore, so we won't have that distraction. I think I've already apologized for the cost of the book in the announcements. It is a spendy book. I'm sorry. I like to go cheap when I can. There are many cheap constitutional law books out there. We could probably almost use the handouts they use at the academy. This is a good book, though. There's a lot of good history here. If you don't understand the history of how these decisions were made, or what led up to these decisions, and I think you're missing half the story. So a lot of good history. I really like the explanations in this book. The only thing this book tends to do, as all constitutional law books kind of a necessity have to do, it's written from a Supreme Court point of view, which is the law of the land nationally. However, as we all know, and as we've done in the discussions now on the discussion board, each state tends to tweak things a little bit. One thing this book talks about a lot, that we've been talking first about, is this pendulum movement back and forth. How we're over here on the high crime control model, or we're over here on the due process model. Another way to think about that is that's a fairly a conservative viewpoint. Conservative viewpoint would be the crime control, lock everybody up and throw away the key model, or a more liberal viewpoint, which would be the due process, a lot of rights type of way of doing things. And historically, each state constitution is a little bit different, which is kind of interesting. You'd think if we all operate under the national scheme, things would be pretty darn similar. And things are pretty darn similar. But there are some tweakings, and that has to do with this exact same pendulum movement back and forth. When did a state become a state? When a state becomes a state, one of the things they do is write the state constitution. And if they become a state during a very conservative time in our nation's history, or if they become a state in a very liberal time in our nation's history, that greatly influences and impacts the way their state constitution is written. I mean, just think about the last few election cycles. I mean, we see that all the time. We see, you know, a liberal president or legislature or courts head off in one direction. A conservative president, legislature, courts head off in another. Reagan did things differently than Carter. Bush did things differently than Ford. So it just depends when a state becomes a state, what their constitution reads like. And then you get these little minor tweaks. And so I don't want you to read in this book that we can search a trunk of a car, or we can search a brown paper bag in a trunk of a car, or we can search a clear plastic container in the trunk of a car, and have you think that that's necessarily true in Alaska. May or may not be. That's why we do that little thing in our discussion that says, but this is Alaska, to try to account for some of the differences. I gave you the link to the legal reviews that the state puts out, the court reviews and the court findings, and that's excellent. That should be your go-to when you need to know or want to know how we do things up here and why. One of the things that's difficult for me coming up here, I did not start my career in Alaska. I started my career in Washington. And when Washington became a state, very liberal time, and we've got some interesting rules down there. I have a really tough time up here working in Alaska, even though I've worked here longer than anywhere. It's not where I was first ingrained. I have a hard time remembering to record people. Up here, not only is tape recording, audio recording of people allowed, it's mandated at times. You have to do it. It's funny, when I built the police department building up here, I put cameras and mics in all of the rooms. Somebody walks into the PD and sits down and starts talking, they're being taped. In Washington, it's just the opposite. Washington's a never record state. You can never record anybody, almost with their permission. It was just recently, an officer was killed down there just a few years ago on a traffic stop, that Washington allowed audio recording from a dash cam in the patrol car. Up until then, you weren't allowed to have those type of dash cam recordings in Washington, and it took this officer getting killed. But now when you walk up on a traffic stop, hi, I'm Officer Bob, can I see your driver's license? And oh, by the way, you're being recorded. You have to warn everybody that they're being recorded. Where up here, it's just, I want to say flagrant, but it's a little bit different. So those are the kind of changes that you want to be aware of with this pendulum moving back and forth, and how things might be different up here compared to what the book says. Book's pretty darn close. This chapter, today, chapter 3, we're going to do something near and dear to our hearts. We're entering search and seizure, which is great law. The courts initially read and read the Fourth Amendment as saying that you're protected in your home and your property from searches and seizures by the government, as being pretty all-encompassing. Now, luckily, the Fourth Amendment, bless their little hearts, has got the magic word that we tend to do, that we tend to live and die by up here: reasonable. You're not protected from all searches and seizures. You're protected from unreasonable searches and seizures. And so the court said, okay, unreasonable means without a warrant. As long as you go get a warrant from a judge, you can search and seize. It is now reasonable to do so. And then over the years, of course, we've picked up the exceptions. Searching and seizing is now like spelling. A before E except after C, I before E except after C, and also on this hand, the plain view doctrine, or consent, or one of the other exceptions. So it's a really neat, interesting topic. And again, pay attention to what the book says, and then to what Alaska says. So good job so far. I know you caught a few mistakes in the last quiz. Good for you. I will claim I do that intentionally, that I'll put the wrong answer in the quiz just so you will question me on it. I'll claim that at least. Everything's going well so far, I think. So go out, enjoy chapter 3, and I'll see you inside.